Sure, I really need this. I do. Okay, it's larger and noisier than I thought. I'll just have to remember to hang on to it, or can I drape it? Will it work that way? Yes? No. Are you picking that up? I don't. No, so I have to hold it up. No, you just didn't work. How would you? Okay, then do you hear me swallow? Well, do you have a definition for home in this state at Ball State University? Do you have a definition for home? Home is where the heart is, as Valentine's Day is coming up. My definition of home is where people are not afraid to argue with you. And I certainly experienced that today, so I know I'm at home. I can relax now and we can just kind of get on with things. I'll just start right in with the slides. It's a fairly long presentation. I don't want to put you all to sleep tonight. If we could have the lights. Who's handling lights? Okay, thank you. Well, 10 miles off the southern coast of Maine, a ledge of granite rocks forms a series of small islands known as the Isles of Shoals, which you see here. In 1839, Celia Layton, later to be Celia Layton Thaxter, aged 4, came to live on these islands with her family. Her father had accepted the position of lighthouse keeper for a small community of fishermen active on these islands. And she grew up here in this barren, windswept place, and that is the wrong set of slides. Please take that other set off because I'll constantly flip to it.
Can you get that set off? With the button over slide, I think you get them off. Just have one set.
One set at a time.
Right. Exactly. It's the most confusing set of buttons. Yeah. Almost the doctors. Wrong bag. What's the one screw?
Those are off.
And just leave the other ones on.
Thank you. Let's see. Does this work? Yes, thank you. Much better. We're back in the barren, windswept place. Okay. Yes, she grew up at Dumbarton Oaks under the ellipse. Celia Layton spent most of her childhood on these islands, and there is so little soil, the climate is so severe, they're shrouded in salt spray most of the time, that no trees can survive here. You only have a shrubby and grassy undergrowth. And growing up here, she really came to love and appreciate every blade of grass and every wildflower that would appear during the summer months. At the age of 5, she made her first garden on these islands, and she continued to garden there for the rest of her life. In about 1847, Celia Layton's parents built Appledore House, a large, white, rambling, wooden clapboard hotel on Appledore Island, which is the largest of these isles. It was one of the first great coastal resorts in New England, and as such, it attracted a number of prestigious guests from the literary and artistic circles in New England, including Harriet Beecher Stowe, John Greenleaf Whittier, William Morris Hunt, and James Russell Lowell, all of whom came to summer periodically at Appledore. Celia Layton met and married Levi Thaxter, her tutor, who was a member of the literary circles visiting. And in 1851, she moved from the islands to her home on the mainland in Massachusetts, where she raised a family. But despite her husband's wealthy background, they were at various times in financial straits, and Celia Layton Thaxter wrote prose and poetry and sold it to New England magazines to earn a small income. She often had to return to the islands to care for her aging parents and also to help to run the hotel. Her husband refused to accompany her on these trips after a boating accident in which he almost drowned. Thaxter would occupy this small house called the Cottage adjacent to Appledore House Hotel. And during the summer months, various artists would find their way to her door, attracted by her reputation as a popular hostess, and also attracted by the small garden which she created around this house. One of the most famous artists to meet and become friends with Thaxter was the American Impressionist Child Hassam, who came each summer to paint the scenery on the islands and began a series of landscape paintings of Celia Thaxter's garden. This garden was created with great trouble by bringing topsoil, plants, seeds, tools over from the mainland on her frequent trips back and forth on the ferry. And Thaxter noted in her journals having to rise at daybreak to find the time to work on this garden area, as well as waging a constant war against the birds and insects which sweep across the islands periodically and devour every living green shoot that they can find in their path. Hassam would bring fame to her garden through his paintings, and painted even the interior of the cottage, where she would arrange small vases of flowers, and one person described it as being like, as entering the room was like diving into a rainbow. In 1893, Celia's friends persuaded her to write up her gardening journals in a book form and have Hassam illustrate them with 22 watercolor illustrations, which we see here. The book was published under the title An Island Garden in 1894, and that was the same year in which Celia Thaxter died. But for many years after her death, day trippers would come over from the mainland on the ferries during the summer months to see this attraction, and it did become a major tourist attraction on the Isles of Shoals. Now, in the same year that Thaxter died and An Island Garden was published, a young woman by the name of Beatrix Jones was just beginning her education in landscape gardening, not landscape architecture, but landscape gardening. And she would become one of the first, and certainly the most famous woman, to enter the professional ranks of American landscape architecture at the turn of the century. However, following Miss Jones, who is better known as Beatrix Farren today, would be Marion Kruger Coffin, seen here in an illustration from early House and Garden magazines, Net Hoyt Flanders, Ellen Biddle Shipman, Elizabeth Strang, and Ruth Dean, and Grace Tabor. While Celia Thaxter holds an important place in American garden history, she was, after all, self-taught and an amateur, and working solely on garden making for her own pleasure rather than for profit. Beatrix Farren, on the other hand, was one of the first true professional designers in this field, and her career would be dramatically different from the preceding. The changing political, social, and economic situation of women in the 1890s allowed them for the first time to obtain college educations and pursue careers, even if it meant social and certainly matrimonial suicide. The large number of suburban and rural estates being built at this time by the wealthy middle and upper classes also afforded them the opportunity to enter into the area of residential landscape design. And after the Depression, of course, the picture would change dramatically again. Today, much of their work still goes unrecognized, unacknowledged, unnamed, and it frequently turns up in the most unlikely places. This is Lorenzo, an early 19th century estate in northern New York State in Cazenovia, New York, where there is a private college today. Lorenzo is supposedly managed by New York State as a period piece with a historic garden. And recently when I went there to photograph a so-called early 19th century garden, what I found instead was actually the remnants of a flower garden designed by Ellen Shipman. And you often find these later designs carelessly incorporated into a so-called historic period garden. And many of them have been designed by the women designers of that estate time period. The style in which many of these women were designing, another view of the Shipman or the remains of the Shipman garden at Lorenzo, the style in which many of these women were working was a combination of formal garden design and naturalistic landscape design. In the two women's work we'll look at tonight, the two styles are very harmoniously blended, well incorporated, one within the other. In other professional designers' work, the two almost stand as separate entities. This was a very popular style of design at the turn of the century. It was a style that was being taught within the programs operated in the New England states. And it did draw largely on classical motifs observed from Italian Renaissance villas that were of great interest to both architects, artists, and landscape architects of the period. So we end up in this country with a distilled version of the Italian Renaissance villa, and we end up with Italianate garden design. Some of the characteristics you notice have great similarity to the original designs at sites such as Villa Lante in northern Italy. And the plans, when one looks at them, this is a plan view of Villa Lante designed in the 1500s, have great similarity to the designs of self-made landscape architects such as Charles Platt, who was working in New England from the 1890s through the early decades of the 20th century. And this would be one of Charles Platt's design for a garden that was featured in publications around 1900, 1901, Garden of the Weld, an estate in Brookline, Massachusetts. Platt's designs would be the model for the early programs in landscape architecture, and you'll notice great differences between their format and the style that we call a formal design today. Pools, fountains, urns, many items drawn directly or imported directly from Italy. One of Platt's other designs, Faulkner Farm, Brookline, Massachusetts. Neither of these estates remains to be studied. And again, a formal layout. Americans, however, were also working with the romantic image of the English cottage garden as popularized by writers such as Gertrude Jekyll. And they were very interested on one level in this style of design and also in gardens using color schemes. tones, color harmonies that were planned and thought out for a specific sequence of bloom. If we look at the career of two individuals out of the group that I mentioned earlier, let's look first at the work of Beatrix Farren as certainly one of the finest designers to arise during this time period. She was born in 1872 in New York City, and she was a niece of Edith Wharton. Her parents divorced 11 years after her birth, and her mother became literary agent for Edith Wharton. It was a very important connection to the prominent social circles of New York from which she would draw her clientele. In 1893, Beatrix Jones, as a young woman, was very interested in plants, and on the suggestion of Charles Sprague Sargent, director of the Arnold Arboretum, she went to live with the Sargent family in Brookline, Massachusetts, so that she could study plant material under Professor Sargent's direction. And these are photographs of the estate of Home Lee, the Sargent property in Brookline, where she would live. She worked under Sargent's guidance for several months, benefiting by both his criticism and his enthusiasm. And this was the beginning of her education in landscape architecture. When she left the Arboretum, and this is another view of the Elm Lee estate, when she left the Arboretum, Sargent suggests that she contact Professor Ware, Dean of the School of Architecture at Columbia University, and see if she could piece together an education appropriate to a career in landscape gardening. So there she pursued various courses in architectural design as well as engineering. In 1895, she went to Europe with her mother and toured various of the great gardens of Italy, France, England, and Germany, not just visiting the sites, but carefully measuring, photographing, sketching, and studying them. And much of the detail that she used in her later American designs comes from this period of study in Europe and subsequent trips that she would make throughout her career. In 1896, she was ready to go to work, but where does one find one's first client? Well, she returned for guidance to Professor Sargent, who is seen here in a sketch. And she describes her encounter as being terrified and excited by the possibility that Sargent had found her a client venturous enough to give her her first opportunity. But when she asked what she should do on this first piece of work, Sargent said with his pleasant yet grim smile, "Do what your client wants." And possibly this was the design that he was speaking of at the time. It was the William Garrison estate in Tuxedo, New York. Very interesting for the work of an individual who supposedly loved plants as well as loving architecture. Her career was to develop from there, however, designing smaller suburban properties, projects such as flower gardens for various family contacts, as well as soon moving into quite large and elaborate garden designs, such as the property in this shot, which is the Newbold estate in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania. And again, you can see that she is drawing directly from the Italian formal garden design format that was popular during that time period. In 1912, she became landscape architect for Princeton University. Her clients were not limited to the private sector by any means. Soon after that, she became landscape consultant for Yale University, where she met Max Farren, professor of history, and married him in 1913. In 1913, she would also the quad at Princeton University and an illustration of Yale from the Yale Project. She would also design in 1913 the White House garden for President Woodrow Wilson. In 1927, Max Farren became director of the Huntington Library in California, and now Beatrix Farren would have to divide her time between the West Coast and the East Coast and the property she had inherited on Mount Desert Island in Maine. Some of her finest projects, however, that we see, this is Beatrix Farren seen here with the famous English horticulturist William Robinson. Some of Farren's finest projects today remain the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Garden in Seal Harbor, Maine, which is periodically open to the public and periodically closed to the public, depending on its condition and its wear and tear. This is a private estate still owned by the Rockefeller family, and it was a design that Farren started in 1926 and would continue to work on for the next 24 years. So if you're worried about your design projects not looking quite right after those first few juries, it's not surprising. If you were given 24 years to install and perfect a design, you might be able to come up with something like this. Several people have pointed out, however, that Farren's finest work was really done when she worked in conjunction with a client who appreciated her talents and was personally interested in landscape design and would work hand in hand with her on developing and improving the site over a long period of time. We're looking at one small part of the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Garden, the walled flower garden. And a few details of this area. And a plan for that project. Part of her assignment in designing this area was to display a collection of Oriental art which the Rockefellers had in their possession. And one of the ways of displaying this was the Guardian Walk she developed onto the outside of the walled flower garden. Perhaps Beatrix Farren's finest projects today, though, the true monument to her genius as a designer, are the gardens at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., designed for Mr. and Mrs. Robert Woods Bliss beginning in 1921. And again, this was a project that she would work on for about a 26-year period, carefully refining, developing, and improving on the planting and the maintenance program for the estate. It lies in a hilly section of Georgetown with a quite steep change in grade on the north facade of the building. This is the south-facing facade, the actual front of Dumbarton Oaks House. And the landscape design in this area is very simple, and it basically has a theme of greenery throughout much of the year, including the winter, by her careful choice and a very subtle choice of evergreen material. And it is based on a naturalistic design, almost creating the effect of a parkland in miniature for this estate. It's very different from the landscape gardens on the north sides of the property. Then behind the house was a deep ravine, which Farren was to use in a remarkable way, developing for this design. And some people mistakenly feel that Farren worked strictly with flower gardens, with small-scale designs. I think Dumbarton Oaks shows her genius in dealing with much larger, more complex spaces and architectural detail. That photograph comes from the 1920s, developed over a long period of time into a series of terraces stepping down the side of the hill and looking out from the formal garden areas onto a naturalistic woodland and meadow combination. Today, Dumbarton Oaks, as a public nonprofit institution with several educational programs and a museum, as well as operating the gardens for the public, has to make use of various spaces around the house. And so they use the back terraces as outdoor dining areas from time to time. This would be the the northern entrance to the house, which looks out over a grass parterre, which does have a grade change carefully disguised by a series of turf steps. So that single expanse of lawn that you're looking at is actually broken. But that is not visible from the point of view from the house. Notice a detail on walls, steps, paving materials shown in these gardens. It's quite remarkable. It's a wonderful place to take students to study because there is so much to look at and the property has been so well maintained. All of this is relatively intact as Farron may have laid it out. Changes are coming slowly, particularly in the vegetation, but the architectural details, the spaces are there. Interesting combinations of paving materials which change as one makes transitions away from the house into a more naturalistic landscape. I almost feel like asking Noelle to comment on this garden because I'm sure it's one that she has studied and loves dearly. Planting plans have been interpreted from Farron's time period, but Farron had the foresight to write up a management program for the property which outlined her design concepts for each of these areas and gave guidelines for changes that she predicted would occur over a long period of time. And this is one step that is very often missing in the design work that's carried out today. The swimming pool terrace is carefully tucked into the hillside. It's not at first visible from the house. You're not even aware that that you can reach this area until you're in it. Emphasis on proportion and detail appropriate to the Georgian style of the architecture as one moves out from the building into the landscape. This is the orangery, the conservatory, on the east side of the house and showing an interior view of the conservatory. Walking away from this area down again a hillside, a slope a little bit more gradual, you come first to this area featuring the urn. It's the urn terrace and a scroll work pattern in the paving, a pierced brick wall rather than a solid brick wall. Some of the later detail work that was done is rather ornate and Baroque in feeling, and this was not Beatrix Farron's work. Notice combinations of foliage and architectural pattern that match each other, that complement each other. The beautiful warmth of this area, both in winter and in summertime, is apparent. It's a very welcoming, enlivening space to be in for many different reasons. The finest collection of garden seats in this country is at Dumbarton Oaks. Each one was an original design that Mrs. Bliss had crafted in teak. Now, from the urn terrace, you descend to the rose garden terrace. And the bench, which is a double-sided bench on two different levels of that rose garden terrace area. If we could only still build landscapes like this. Entrances to each of these areas, so beautifully defined, so stately in their proportions and their detailing. And notice again the change in paving materials as you would move out of the formal garden area along a more natural path leading you into that parkland that I showed you earlier. So many sensual clues to tell you how to move through these spaces. The amphitheater today was once called Lover's Lane Pool, and it was a shallow pool photograph from 1930s to show you how this area has changed and been modified to meet current safety requirements of a public institution. This was Lover's Lane Pool in 1938. Let me just flip back for a minute if I can. I don't know if I can. Yes. Okay, it was not safe to leave water in this area for the danger of small children tumbling into it, and the area was used as a concert amphitheater. So the pool remains empty, showing its paving pattern. And we can see the scale of the walls that step up from this area. They're rather low, very gentle curves to them, and a very interesting pattern that they create. Notice the brickwork and the brick scroll edges to this area, and combination of the turf steps with the brick edging. Lines that practically undulate and then stop. From the amphitheater or Lover's Lane, you are led out into a meadow that's underplanted with naturalized bulbs for a springtime display, and you're led around the base of the gardens back into them from another approach. Here too, Farron shows her genius for offering people various choices of movement through these garden areas. For my own personal interest and aesthetic taste, I find this hornbeam ellipse one of the most beautiful spaces ever created in the American landscape. It is modeled on formal gardens of Europe. Originally, these type of ellipse would have been created in European hornbeam. The translation here is done in a native tree, the American hornbeam, for maintenance reasons primarily. And the center of the area is simply a turf panel with the focal point being the fountain. Simple, elegant, understated. Would it be designed today? The next set of slides, please. Now, Farron was occupied with many major clients throughout the course of her career, but she was also involved with developing a center for the study of landscape architecture on her property, on her estate in Seal Harbor, Maine, Mount Desert Island. And she was collecting plans, antique horticultural books, any great works that she could find documenting the history of landscape architecture in the Western world for this center of study, which was to be operated by Harvard University. She could not come to an agreement with Harvard about the operation of this project and eventually ended up disbanding it. These are additional views of Dumbarton Oaks. The pebble mosaic fountain area was not Farron's design. It was done later on and has a very different Baroque feeling from anything that Farron had created, but very beautifully set within her areas. The symbol of the family, the wheat sheaf. Everything at Dumbarton Oaks was designed with equal care and attention to its aesthetic appearance as well as its function, such as the greenhouses complex or palm house, which serves as purely service facility today and is not open to the public. Towards the end of her life, it must have been a great disappointment to Farron to find that some of the designs she had created were not going to be maintained in the way she had envisioned. to find that the educational interest she had could not be continued with the Center for the Study of Landscape Architecture at Reef Point, her estate in Maine, that it was necessary for her to actually disband the collection and destroy the gardens there, remove the plant material, and give it to individuals. This is a glass photograph, probably hand-tinted, of one of the garden areas at Reef Point. And the dismembering of that collection was done roughly in 1955, and Farron passed away in 1959. She would be followed, however, by many other women for whom she had served as a model in entering this career. Marion Kruger Coffin was one of her followers who would be very famous in the states, the northeastern states, for her design for large private estates belonging to the DuPonts, the Rockefellers, and the Vanderbilts. Her education parallels Beatrix Farron's to a certain extent, but by the time she was entering the field, formal programs in landscape architecture had been started at MIT and Harvard. MIT admitted women and Harvard did not. So she chose to pursue her education at MIT as a special student. Marion Coffin was another New Yorker, born into a patrician family in New York in 1876, and her parents had separated, leaving her mother in financial straits, which meant that when she achieved adulthood, she realized that she would have to work to earn her own living. She couldn't simply depend on relatives. And around 1900, she decided, on the advice of several friends who knew of her interest in nature and knew of her creative abilities, she decided to pursue a career in, again, landscape gardening, as it was then called. She heard that the best program in the country was operated from MIT, and she went there to talk to the administrators about admitting her to this program. However, when they learned that she had the barest smattering of mathematical education, they turned from her in contempt. And the science and math requirements for this school were necessarily very stringent, and many young women of that time period simply weren't educated to the extent that a university such as MIT would require. She was encouraged, however, by the head of the architectural school there, and also by Professor Sargent again of the Arnold Arboretum, to pursue private tutoring in mathematics, to reapply for MIT's program as a special student, and a year later she was admitted to their program. Her obtaining a degree as a special student meant, however, that she would follow the same course of instruction as all her fellow students in landscape architecture in a program largely based on an architectural program. However, she could complete that program. She would not receive a degree at the end. She describes her 3 years at MIT as the most grueling time period of her life. So if you feel like you're suffering now as students at Ball State, you are in good company. We have certainly all felt that we've suffered through our educational times. The program at MIT in 1901 required students to take courses in surveying, biological sciences, geology, engineering, botany, architectural design, and horticulture. Horticultural classes were held at the Arnold Arboretum twice a week rather than held on the urban campus. And it was a very strict and demanding program. Through the course of her time at MIT, however, she was to make a very important friendship, and that was with the young Henry Francis DuPont of Wilmington, Delaware, who would inherit the Winneter estate in the 1920s and who is seen here in an early photograph with his mother and sister like 3 peas in a pod. These individuals would be very important characters featuring in Marion Coffin's career. Henry Francis DuPont became very interested in her development as a landscape architect, hired her for several of his more important projects, hired her as a consultant for many of the public gardens that he worked with, and also made sure that the numerous members of the DuPont family used her in developing their estates around northern Delaware. She didn't just work in northern Delaware, however. She did work along the New England coast and largely in New York, Kentucky, and the Midwest. Her education, again, in keeping with the time period, was a combination of formal design and naturalistic design. This is one of her first projects, a design for property in Kentucky, a private estate in Kentucky, and she was employed here simply to lay out flower garden areas around the estate. Coffin's work is very interesting, however, for her sense of scale and proportion and her attention to not only plant material but to architectural detail. And this was obviously a reflection of the courses that she had taken at MIT. And it makes me wonder if our programs today aren't a little too lenient in these areas. She graduated in 1904. She found that none of the offices in New York would employ a woman because they just could not imagine how a young woman could oversee contractors' installation on the grounds of these estates, and she decided that she would simply have to hang out her own slate and see if she could attract clients who were, again, courageous enough to hire her. Fortunately, she did have the social contacts to acquire quite large and interesting projects at an early point in her career, but her career, again, took off slowly. It was very important that she publicize her work, and she constantly had even her early estate projects documented photographically and written up for journals such as House and Garden, Home Beautiful, Country Life in America, constantly trying to put her work before the public's eye. Another way in which she competed and attempted to attain professional recognition was through the Architectural League of New York, their annual awards. She constantly entered that, and in 1933 would receive a gold medal for design. Another of her early projects was an estate outside of Wilmington, Delaware, the Lamont DuPont estate, again, a formal flower garden, let's say, design set in a more naturalistic park area. This property has been entirely destroyed in the development of Wilmington from the small city at the turn of the century to a decent-sized city today. Coffin's work does survive, however, intact on a private estate just within the city limits. This is the estate known as Gibraltar. It was a property of H. Rodney Sharp, who had married into the DuPont family, though I would never say that in Delaware. I can say it here. And in 1918, he purchased an old stone farmhouse in a rural setting just beyond the city limits, and he hired, on Henry Francis DuPont's recommendation, hired Marion Coffin to come down and provide a landscape design for a series of terraces connecting the house with a swimming pool area for entertainment, flower gardens, outdoor pavilion, and orienting the drive, the garages, etc., the service areas of the house within a naturalistic landscape. The garden today is overgrown, not perfectly maintained, but the backbones of the design are still there. There's a very steep change in grade from the house to what is a swimming pool terrace. And this area is, this slope was crossed with this rather bizarre marble staircase that truly should have been in one of the great plantation houses and ends up being an outdoor feature with a wrought iron railing. Very beautiful feature, completely misplaced into the landscape. Some of the other DuPonts were appalled at this. This was not Coffin's design, however, as much as the client's desire. So here again, you have to do what your client wants. This leads to a swimming pool terrace. Today the area is roughly unchanged, a little bit more run down. This was the swimming pool terrace area, a beautiful level area set within large, massive stone walls. One wall is a retaining wall holding the upper bank, and a far wall hides the service area. And located into that wall was a bathing house, a changing room, also a room from which outdoor entertaining could be carried on. And this terrace, the pool has been filled in, turfed over for safety reasons, the terrace area as it appears today. She was very ingenious in fitting spaces together. Given unusual topography, given a flat site, she could make it far more interesting than it normally would appear. The lower flower garden terrace of the estate of Gibraltar was laid out in this fashion to have changing displays of flowering annuals, bulbs throughout the seasons, the broken flag paving, and a grass parterre. And today this area is in this condition, giving you an idea of the status of some of these designs. It's unusual to even find one of Coffin's private estate gardens intact. And the fate of this particular garden area is of limited time, and it's probably going to be destroyed at some point for development. The flower terrace opens to an alley of bald cypress leading to a tea pavilion that once looked out over the farm fields surrounding Wilmington. And a very interesting color scheme is created under the bald cypress trees. And it's an interesting plant to use to create a formal alley, one which we don't normally associate with this type of formal design. It had been used before at Longwood Gardens, where the taxodium alley still survives. The so-called tea pavilion, which terminates that view, and the axis of this walk. Now, leaving Gibraltar behind, this was an important project to have worked on in Delaware because it led to her employment as landscape architect for the developing campus of the University of Delaware as a change from a very small private college to a state campus. Beatrix Farrant featured here with one of her other college projects, but a view of the University of Delaware quad in the 1920s. You can probably date it from the vehicles. It may be even a little bit earlier than that. H. Rodney Sharp, the owner of Gibraltar, was the head of the trustee advisory committee on the grounds for the university campus, and his money was largely funding the landscape plan which Coffin would install. So she was, in a sense, working for a private individual in developing this public site. This was a project on which she would be employed as advisor over a number of years. She designed the planting plans, the ground circulation patterns for the Women's College, which was incorporated into the university scheme. And most of the plantings which she designed have now been removed to allow room for further expansion of the campus buildings. So very little of her designs from the 20s, 30s, and even 40s have remained. It was interesting to see a student research this campus plan, and his analysis of her design work talking about the limited palette of plants that was used by designers during the estate days, when in effect their plant palette or the plants available to them were much, much wider than you have available to you today. And they were probably more carefully selected, hardier. One of the celebrations which took place on the Women's College, which she participated, Coffin's finest design, preserved as a public institution, are segments of the landscape gardens on the Winterthur Estate in northern Delaware. Winterthur is a very large museum devoted to the American decorative arts. The museum itself has over 100 display rooms and is currently mounting an $18 million development project to expand the museum into new gallery and administrative space, bridging this small creek valley. So the new building will float right across this area. It was the estate of Henry Francis DuPont, early friend of Marion Coffin, an individual who had studied landscape design and horticulture himself at Harvard University and developed the grounds of this private estate roughly over a 60-year period, from being a farming property with a purely rural landscape into being a magnificent landscape gardens of 60 acres surrounded by a property of over 300 acres today. DuPont was very interested in the American decorative arts. Some of the details of his landscape garden are almost a spoof on Americans' fascination with their colonial heritage. And some of them were done tongue-in-cheek and yet beautifully designed, such as including the classically designed garden house overlooking the view that you saw before. Coffin came here in the 1920s to work on a landscape plan to connect his home, which had become a museum, with the surrounding gardens. And he relied on her to develop a plan that was architectural and spatial in an extent which he didn't feel competent to deal with. This is one view of the museum today. It is a very large and sprawling building. The areas that she created are a series of terraces, again stepping down a grade from the museum building itself to an enclosed formal garden, which included a swimming pool terrace. This would be one of the upper terraces seen today, and a view of that area as it was designed and as it appeared when it was first opened in the 1930s. These photographs were ones that were made to publicize her work by an architectural photographer in New York. This series of outdoor rooms, each having a different theme, slowly makes the transition from the building out into a surrounding natural woodland, almost a wild garden. And one of these areas was a box scroll garden, which was only recently restored, and it had been very badly neglected for a period of 15 years or more. I think you can see the similarities, though, in the design of her spaces here with the design of areas of Gibraltar. This is the box scroll garden as it appears today. Coffin's plan would include a large segment of the gardens immediately around the house, most of which have been preserved, even though their plantings have changed dramatically from the lowered maintenance that we have as a public institution there. She also designed the circulation system, bridges, turnarounds, parking areas, service areas to connect these spaces, to unite them in a harmonious way. DuPont was very sensitive to and appreciative of the natural landscape of the Brandywine Valley. the landscape that he had known growing up in this area. And he wanted even his formal gardens to merge with that natural landscape, not changing the topography too drastically. So she nestles these formal gardens, which you see on the right-hand side of this photograph, into the hillside, and almost separates them from DuPont's landscape gardens. Other views of those areas include this rather atrocious main staircase that descended the slope, and a more elegant staircase now, which do you think was designed by Coffin? That preceding stairway was not designed by Coffin. It was part of an earlier design that she had to incorporate into her work, that she inherited. Her way of making the transition from the house down this steep wooded slope to a swimming pool area, as we see it here. Very simple, very elegant. And that area looking down onto the swimming pool as it would appear today, with the wrought iron gates as the entranceway. Some of the details around that area, again, photographs taken in the 1930s when the garden was maintained in its prime and contained a completely color-schemed selection of flowering plants. Other views of the bathing pavilions, the swimming pool terrace for this area. And one small detail, the type of design that the DuPonts are famous for, they would never throw away anything. This wrought iron, this bronze railing came off of the roof of the original DuPont house when Henry Francis DuPont enlarged it, and he wanted to find a place to use it. So he found a place in the garden, and it does act as a beautiful foil between the formal garden areas and the woodland beyond. Recycling everything, and a view of that swimming pool terrace in the autumn. Other sections of the landscape that she worked on was a very large and extensive iris garden, laid out as islands of iris within grass paths on an elongated axis across a slope, punctuated with these very interesting Oriental-style garden structures dating from the early 19th century and from a Wilmington estate. The iris were laid out in a color scheme, a graduated color scheme that made transitions from smoky bronze colors through purples, through blues, through pale yellows to white. And it is a 300-foot long swath that was divided up. The planting plan she worked out in conjunction with DuPont, who actually bred many of the colors iris that were used. It lasted approximately 4 years, and it had to be removed because of insect and pest problems, and it simply was unmaintainable at a perfect level. So this was one very large and expensive segment of the Winter Gardens which do not survive very long. And the only photograph we have of Marion Coffin with her lifelong friend Henry Francis DuPont, a fellow garden designer, in the iris gardens. The structures, however, remain throughout this area. Coffin helped site these buildings. And these, again, they were taken from the estate of a China trade merchant in Wilmington, Delaware. They date from, the second quarter of the 1800s, and they have been replicated exactly as they were found for the Winter property. They include the summer pavilion, that mushroom seat that you saw before, as well as the more classically designed white gates, which mark an entrance to the Pinetum and the Winter estate. So Coffin was very influential in helping her friends sort out the spatial design for Winter Gardens. Since this property will be maintained for the public, and the integrity of the design is there, if not all the details. One example would be, does anybody recognize the function of this type of sculpture? Have you seen objects like this ever? I don't hear anything, so I guess that means no. These are iron stove tops that used to be placed on top of coal-burning or wood-burning stoves to radiate the heat through a room in the 1800s. And by the 1920s, they were being sold as simply ornaments of very little value, of very little interest. DuPont collected several of these. Originally, they were painted black. He painted them white, and he used them as mock classical statuary in his gardens, because his garden is an American garden, not an Italian-aid garden. And again, with tongue-in-cheek, he was really poking fun at all the colonial revivalists practicing and making their little boxwood patterns, their Williamsburg gardens at that time period. These statues have moved around quite a bit. You think that a public garden would not see that much change in the course of its management, but in many ways, these gardens changed as much as some of the private estates have. It was Martha and George. How appropriate. Anyway, they're back in the place they were originally cited by Marion Coffin. Coffin considered Winterthur and an estate on Long Island named Clayton as her finest designs towards the end of her career. This is the Childs Frick estate, Clayton. It's in Roslyn, New York, and the Nassau County Museum of Fine Arts is making some effort to restore this fine design. And it demonstrates several of her skills, not only with creating very interesting planting plans, but in modifying a formal garden to a very simple and refined state of elegance. It was a 4-acre vegetable and fruit garden for the property originally. She was called in the 1920s to redesign the area as a more formal flower garden for the property. It was enclosed by hedges, and the original design as a vegetable garden was also probably enclosed by a surrounding hedge. She placed the circular pool at the center of it to act as a focal point, laid out very beautiful perennial flowering garden borders, emphasized these with brick edging and low boxwood hedges, completely enclosed the garden as separate spaces to her, because it did change over subsequent years. A boxwood scroll area and a rose garden incorporated in one of the segments, and other views of the Clayton estate. They have really been able to restore very little of the original design. The Zodiac garden, which was a point in the path leading from the house to this flower garden, as designed by Marion Coffin. She was one designer who did not like drafting very much. She much preferred to be out on the grounds, laying out the areas with stakes, with line, with wire, surveying, working with, overseeing the actual installation and all the work that was done on the property. And as soon as she could afford to hire draftsmen for her office, she did, and spent much more of her time with her clients than in the office. And that was probably a very sensible way to operate. She did operate an office out of New York until the 1930s Depression, when many offices shut down completely. She was able to survive. Am I going backwards? Yes. What's going on here? She was able to survive by closing the New York office and moving to her private home and maintaining her office from New Haven, Connecticut. one view of the supposedly restored gardens at the Museum of Fine Arts. I don't think this project is going to get too much further. Restoration of a very large and interesting trellis they have made out of teak did appear in the New York Times last year, but that trellis was designed by an architectural firm in New York. In contrast, let's look at some of the great estate design of Long Island at the same time period. I wouldn't want to name the designer in this case. The appropriate use of plant material, very graceful and carefully maintained forms, the inviting, welcoming feature in the front of this Long Island mansion. Just a quick comparison. At the height of her career, Coffin was awarded the gold medal from the Architectural League of New York for 2 garden designs she had completed. She brought many young apprentices into her firm, trained them, people who would go on to become active in the New York Parks Department, Housing Department, for example, Clara Kofi. She worked on her sites with her assistants, and she ran her office from this building, her home in New Haven, Connecticut, as an economic survival measure. She did survive through the Depression years, and she did attract a number of large clients again when prospects became better. She also worked within the public sector. She worked for institutions, and this again did help her to survive some very difficult times. She published a book called Trees and Shrubs for Landscape Effects because she felt that too much emphasis was being put on flowers in garden design, landscape design overall at that time period, and was invited by DuPont to serve on a committee to redesign Rose Garden and a conifer collection at the New York Botanic Garden, among one of several projects she worked on for Botanic Gardens. Interestingly enough, their committee ended up having 2 members, herself and DuPont. So they were able to move forward quite rapidly. In 1955, Coffin returned to the Winter Estate to design one last garden area, which was called at that time the April Garden. Today it's known as the Sundial Garden. DuPont wanted to transform his tennis court and his lawn croquet court, seen here, into another garden area for the enjoyment of the public, who were now coming to Winter each spring to visit both the gardens and the museum. The intent of this design was to have masses, and I have put this plan upside down on purpose, not so that you couldn't read it, but so you will see the similarity when we look at the aerial photograph of that area. She used an elliptical form at the center, only the scantest outlines of the formal design surrounded by very large, soft, billowing masses of plant material that will blend this area into the surrounding woodland. It was intended to be at its peak during April. It includes a number of magnolias, spireas, lilac, azaleas, early flowering azaleas. Here's the area as it appeared a few years ago. It recently had to be restored. Notice that they have eliminated some of the central beds by this time. A sundial was eventually placed in the center of the ellipse, and that became the focal point for the garden. Thank you. Okay, from the ground view, eye-level perspective of this area, it is like walking within one giant impressionist painting. All of the color that's visible is the color coming from very small flowers within the landscape. So it's broken up like points of light or points of color. And it's quite a remarkable space. It's in a peak period of bloom for only 2 weeks at most. And it is during the April month, so it's certainly, from from my point of view, one of the most fascinating design spaces to visit. The area leads out, however, to other garden areas, wilder garden areas in the surrounding hill. And it was the last garden area that Coffin would design at Winterthur, one that has been preserved and fairly well maintained today. Recently, it's been replanted, and we've lost some of that massive and rather magical effect of the plantings. In 1957, not long after a visit to inspect the April Garden at Winterthur, Coffin died. Her obituary was in the New York Times and restates her interest in both the Winterthur project and the Clayton estate as being the finest work that she had undertaken during her lifetime. She was the individual who stated that the women entering the professional field at that time were truly being pioneers in a new old profession, and one in which it took all of one's ability to see and interpret beauty out of doors to create the types of landscapes they had. Some of the other programs that had been founded in the early decades of the 20th century were programs in landscape design as well as in horticulture, the changing times, encouraging women to enter these professions, not widely accepted at the time by any means. One of these programs was at Ambler, and it was the beginning of the department I'm now in. It was the Pennsylvania School of Horticulture for Women, founded in 1910. And these are just some early photographs of the school, which was run out of an old farm building, and early photographs of the women's classes. This program was very much based on practical hands-on experience. The Ambler School emphasized agriculture, gardening, and horticulture. The Lothorpe School in Groton, Massachusetts, founded a few years afterwards, emphasized landscape design. Pruning classes as they are today, what I shall return to soon. Our program started in 1910 has somehow or other survived intact and has come under the wing of Temple University in the late 1950s, and now is thriving again with both 2- and 4-year degree programs. And we have moved from being a farming and horticultural program to a landscape architecture and horticultural program, carrying on that great heritage. Also, another note, that early garden I talked about, the Thaxter Garden on the Isles of Shoals, was recently restored by Cornell's Marine Laboratory, which operates on those islands during the summer months. And Dr. Kingsbury, the head of the Marine Laboratory for many years, was very interested in recreating Thaxter's garden. And her book, An Island Garden, has been published as well. So I hope at some time you'll be able to go and visit some of these sites, certainly Dumbarton Oaks, certainly Winterthur Garden, and perhaps someday you'll make that journey out to the Isles of Shoals. Thank you very much. I would be happy to entertain questions, whoever is still alive out there. Lights? One or two. Does anyone have any questions before we close? Yes, there are some, and what has happened is their documents are harder to find. There is less documentation. Coffin's documents would have been destroyed, except a very young friend of hers ended up purchasing her house after she died. And he found in the attic a collection of letters, correspondence, some of her business papers. And he heard that Winterthur was interested in garden history, contacted somebody at Winterthur, and Winterthur, without knowing why they were acquiring the collection, took the collection into their archives, where it sat for many years until I found what a strong influence she had had on a public garden and kind of resurrected her. If not for that fluke, we would have nothing on her, or very, very little. And that seems to be the case. So these women who were from the patrician families, one way or another, their network of friends and families had preserved the documents of their work, whereas there are many other individuals of equal importance. We have nothing, or almost nothing. And you find the collections broken up, as probably with any designer, broken up, and they're all over the place. If you are looking for something, it's very difficult. Yes?
They show a history of the garden, they would show what was being done at the time.
Okay, there was a question about the role of popular magazines, and yes, you can reconstruct much of the popular landscape design by looking at magazines at the turn of the century and how they change through time. But they are a very good vehicle for documentation. And show a fairly wide range of styles, though you're going to be limited to the larger properties, the more elaborate properties. You're not looking at the small suburban home too often. I do think they served the role of popularizing some of the style on a smaller scale, but they were also magazines purchased by the type of clients that you wanted to hire you. So you wanted to put your name in front of those people on their coffee tables so that they would see your work and they would talk about you. And it's funny because I don't think we look at publication of design in quite the same way today, and it's so much more competitive to have your work published in that sense. And this group of designers of the estate time period really worked that vehicle, but it was difficult. It meant a constant output, and you paid the expenses of having professional photographers document your work. And it was difficult for them to keep on top of that and keep doing that as well as do their design work. And also the importance of entering the competitions. That was very, very important. Something, again, we may neglect to a certain extent today. Other questions? Well, I'll let you go. It's been a long day. Thank you very much.